JFK, where he said Kennedy was not going to put Americans in Vietnam.
Let me actually ask you about that. As I said at the beginning of the show, many millions of people around the world have by now been introduced to you, at least indirectly, through the character of the Mr. X in Oliver Stone's movie JFK. You were in correspondence and communication with Oliver Stone throughout much of the preparation and making of the movie, and of course prior to that you had a correspondence and working relationship with Jim Garrison. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I know you know that Garrison wrote a book on the trail of the assassin.
Right.
And because we had corresponded for years, he sent me a manuscript of his book, and I thought the book was wonderful, but it was the story of Miami, New Orleans, Dallas, and it didn't think about Washington, New York, Frankfurt, Germany, the money centers. And to me, you got to follow the money line. So I would write to Jim and I say, look, the book is good, but we need to put this in or this. And he respected that. And later, sometime, I don't really know when, we weren't that close, he was talking with Oliver Stone. Stone had an idea of doing this movie. And in the process, showed Stone some of this material that I had written. So Stone called me in July of 1990. And he said, I'm going to be in Washington, I'd like to meet you, and I want you to work as an advisor to this movie I'm planning. So we met, we got along just fine, and I told him I agreed to be an advisor and work with him. So the material, and much of it is straight out of the book. The words that you remember from the film are in the book, and that part of the book I had written in 1985. It was already a series of articles that had been published, already published. And it was based on that the ending of the movie, where Donald Sutherland, who played my part, comes in and talks to Kevin Costner, who played Jim Garrison's part, and they begin to describe why was Kennedy killed. Not who did it and all that sort of thing, or who's covering it up, but why was Kennedy killed? And this is what I tried to answer during that bit of the movie.
I think the movie very much benefited from that scene because it gave the audience a chance to get the bigger picture. And I must say that as good as I found the movie to be, I think the book, your new book, really goes much further in terms of really elaborating on that critical question, cui bono. Apropos of the Kennedy assassination aspect of the book, I think the question that everybody who was alive at the time and old enough to remember is always asked, and it's always very useful to know, is where were you when John Kennedy was assassinated? You were presumably still active duty in the Pentagon at this time. I would think, given your capacity, that you would have been in a sort of a critical position to at least have some window on the security concerns in Dallas and things like that. Were you in Dallas that day? Were you in Washington? Or? In
November of 1963, I was the Chief of Special Operations, which is supporting clandestine operations, CIA, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And rather an unusual meeting. I was walking down the hall in October, and a general said, glad to see you, Prouty. I wanted to talk with you. He said, you are being ordered to go to the South Pole with a group of VIP people who are going down there to install a nuclear plant. And I thought, well, nice vacation, but you know, nuclear is not my business. I've been here 9 years in the Pentagon now, all on one kind of job. But we had some CIA activity in Antarctica, but not enough to warrant a trip down there. So I accepted it in good faith. I saw no problems with it. And the next thing I know, November 10th, I'm on a plane on the way to Honolulu, down to New Zealand, and down to McMurdo Sound and to the South Pole. And we fired up the nuclear plant at McMurdo and then came back to Christchurch, New Zealand. By that time, I'd gotten to know a congressman who was a member of the party quite well. And we were sitting down to breakfast. I never forget this, because down there, that was Saturday morning when the president was killed. And all of a sudden, the radio in the place said, ladies and gentlemen, BBC have announced that Kennedy, President Kennedy, has been killed in Dallas. Boy, you could have heard a pin drop clear to Australia. Stunning news, you know. So there was nothing we could do. There wasn't a radio station. We didn't have radios. So after we finished breakfast, we went out on the street. A few hours later, I was able to buy a newspaper, the Christchurch Star, which I still have, which was in the movie, by the way. Jeff, remember Sutherland?
Right, I do, sure, yeah.
And I looked at the paper, at the terrible news, and of course had nothing else to balance it against except some of my own experience. I had worked on the business of presidential protection. You know, the military is trained in presidential protection. I had gone to Mexico City, for example, with Eisenhower when he went there in 56 or 57 and so on. I was familiar with it. And at times I had to call certain units to be in certain places to provide extra support to the Secret Service. So we were looking at the paper, and up in the corner is a picture of this building where the man that shot the president was alleged to have hidden, called the Texas School Book Depository Building. And as I looked, I saw the windows were open. And I turned to Congressman, I said, Pete, something's wrong. We don't allow that. The windows would be sealed. If the military were there, if the Secret Service was there, those windows would be sealed. Then right beside the picture was a headline that said, 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire killed the president. Of course, having nothing else to go by, I figured that's the way he died. 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire. You know what we have heard now, 3 bullets from an old rifle up on the top of the building. Go boom, boom, boom. Now, reporters on the spot know the difference between an automatic weapon and the... Then down in the lower corner of the paper, very interestingly, it gave the whole biographical story of this young man, Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, we read every word of that, inside the thing, and a whole bunch of it on the inside page, plus a picture of Oswald in a nice business suit, white shirt on, necktie on. Have you ever seen a picture of Oswald dressed like that? When I got back to the States, I kept looking through newspapers everywhere to find a picture of Oswald in a business suit, but that's what had been sent by radio photo somehow to the newspapers around the world before the police in Dallas had arraigned him. I took that paper home, and through my resources in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I made phone calls and checked things out. That information that appeared in that paper about Oswald's biography and everything, all of that part of it, had been written and sent before the police in Dallas had arraigned the man. How could a reporter be working on just some 24-year-old boy and have the story all ready to go if he didn't know from the police who they had charged with the crime? So ever since then, I've been building up more and more information to see these things that were manufactured as a cover story ever since that murder. And of course, the biggest cover story is the Warren Commission report.
Now, let me make sure I get this straight. November 23rd, 1963, in New Zealand, Australia area, is November 22nd in the United States.
Yes,
in other words, this
same.
is really the same day. This is not the following day.
No, it's over the date line. That's right.
And this newspaper in an obscure area of New Zealand, this was?
Well, it's a big city in South Island, Christchurch, yep.
So in other words, this story, this biographical profile, as well as the details of the assassination, was about the very first news coverage that reached Australia and New Zealand.
All prepackaged, see? Now, in a few minutes like this, Jeff, I can't go through the whole thing, but to give you some relevancy here, the president was shot at 12:30 in Dallas. We heard it at 7:30 in New Zealand the next day, but that'll give you how many hours it was. In the book, I go through it very carefully, and it comes out. And you just see that somebody had prepared this whole story to make Oswald the patsy, just as he said he was, just like in the movie. They said that he said he was the patsy, and he was created for that job, which tells you really more about the whole crime than most of us have been willing to accept until we begin to realize the facts of life.
The events of the Kennedy assassination, obviously you don't believe for a minute from reading the book and from other things that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin of John Kennedy. You pointed out to me quite a few months ago in an earlier discussion that we had that shortly before his death, President Lyndon Johnson had made some comments about the Kennedy assassination. Could you tell us about that? It was an interview, I believe, somewhere?
That's one of the most interesting things I have read since the assassination, because, you know, a lot of people say, well, of course Lyndon Johnson was implicated, and so on and so on. It couldn't possibly be. But just before Johnson died in '73, he had had some serious heart trouble, and I'm sure the gentleman knew that he didn't have long to live. He had an old friend who was a writer named Leo Janos, and Janos wrote for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. So anyone who's interested should look in the Atlantic Monthly magazine of July 1973, and I'll quote the best I can. Johnson told Janos he always believed there was a conspiracy. Now that's a pretty big statement for the man that appointed the Warren Commission. It's a pretty big statement, but he told him they always believed there was a conspiracy. Second, he said, although Oswald may have pulled the trigger, he wasn't the only one. So he wasn't alone. The third statement hits like a thunderclap. He said, we have been running a damn murder incorporated in the government. Now, through my work, regrettably so, I have to admit that we do run a murder incorporated. I know where they were. I know most of them are foreigners. I know how they're used and have used them. And I know how they do the job, and it's nothing like Lee Harvey Oswald up sitting on a windowsill. When Johnson said those three things, anybody could wrap up the murder and find out what the problem is right there. Now, nobody, I'm sure, knew the situation closer than Johnson. Remember, for over 19 years, right here in Washington, D.C., Johnson's across-the-street neighbor was J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover and Johnson were that close. What Hoover knew, Johnson knew, except on betting on horses. But other than that, Hoover knew what Johnson knew and vice versa. So there's no surprises when you read that this is what Johnson thought in 1973.
A kind of an evaluative question, which I guess asks you to take a great deal of the material that's extraordinarily well documented in the book and sort of put it in a few brief sentences. Obviously, as you emphasize, the question of who were the actual triggermen is of relatively secondary importance as to who were the actual authors and controllers of the operation. Do you think it's fair to say that the motives behind the Kennedy assassination had to do with the sort of monumental policy changes that he was about to effect, and that could you give us sort of a characterization of who, in general terms, you think was responsible for this?
Well, that's a good way to put it. There's no way in a brief period, I've done it as best I can through the book, to explain that when Kennedy became president, one of the first moves he made, he gave McNamara orders to hold up on the TFX contract. Everybody kind of forget that, but that was a very advanced fighter plane contract worth $6.5 billion in 1961 money, which is a big contract. That's only letting the contract. They usually run 10 times that through what we call life of type. That was big money. They held up the contract, and finally, by a specialized system that McNamara and Arthur Goldberg, the Secretary of Labor, set up, they allocated the contract to a company that had created an area of subcontracting throughout the country in the political counties where Kennedy needed the vote most. Remember, Kennedy got elected by the skin of his teeth. So where he had beaten Nixon by only a few votes, well, put a little factory there. Where Nixon had beaten him a little bit, put a bigger factory there, and they had it spread. It was a beautiful plan. It took walls of the Pentagon covered with these maps. And then McNamara, on the 23rd of November 1962, allocated that contract. Well, in the halls of the Pentagon, you couldn't hear a civil word. I mean, this was Kennedy that, goddamn Kennedy this, because everybody knew that the contract was going to the contractor that the Eisenhower administration had set up. Things like that create pressures. Saying he's not going to put Americans in Vietnam. That war ran to a minimum cost of $220 billion, probably all up $500 billion. People will kill for money like that. They'll kill for contracts within that. 10 million men were flown to Saigon by commercial airline. That was worth $1 billion. They wouldn't have gone. So when you create that kind of pressure, you create what it takes to murder a president. And the decision then is very clean, handled by a few people. The gunmen come from outside the United States. Nobody knows about it. There's no Cubans involved, there's no mafia involved, there's no this involved. All these people that talk about it, that's cover story. Cover story is the most difficult thing to run. That's been running 30 years now. And think of the pressures that cover story has been creating over the last 30 years to keep it up front, to have really famous, intelligent newspapermen say there's no substantive history, anything except that Oswald killed Kennedy, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, it's a cover story. It's ridiculous. The American Medical Association trotted these poor old autopsy people out, and we're saying, oh, well, now the bullet went this way and went through Kennedy, came out of his neck, of course, and went down into Connolly, broke his wrist, right through his head.
Right, exactly.
You know, a cover story is a terrible thing to create. Murder is simple. Just a little scalpel and you do it.
I hate to break off at this point, and I wish we had another 3 hours to continue because we've really just barely scratched the surface. But I want to just at this point say, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, thank you very much for being with us here. Your book is one of the most thought-provoking and critical pieces of historiography that I, for one, have ever read, and I think it's essential reading for anyone trying to get to the bottom of contemporary history. This is Jeff Steinburg, and I want to thank you for being